This is Tom Doody, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in the Google search for my site. This is Slow TV. NYC Subterranean, Fulton Street. Middle platform. Brooklyn bound A and C trains. Uptown bound A and C trains. This used to be Fulton Street. Now it is Fulton Center station. I think this one's still called Fulton Street. Fulton Center is this transit hub that became a reality in the planning following redevelopment of destruction of September 11th, 2001. The trains that you can hear, listeners, the trains that you can hear but cannot see are uptown bound. The trains that pull clear into the view are Brooklyn bound trains. Today is Saturday, June 13th, 2015. This is a front page story on the New York Times, and its newsworthiness does not make it front page news. This is not current. So they put a couple of paragraphs on the front page and then jump it to a story of elsewhere in the newspaper. This is an epic research New York Times piece. There's at least 4 journalists credited on this report. And I'll read all of it slowly on Slow TV. Slow TV is credited to NRK Broadcasting of Norway. Beyond the Chokehold, Path to Eric Garner's Death by Al Baker and David Goodman and Benjamin Mueller. Eric Garner was lumbering along a sidewalk on Staten Island on July day when an unmarked police car pulled up. The plainclothes officer inside knew Mr. Garner well, mostly for selling untaxed cigarettes not far from the nearby Staten Island terminal. Mr. Garner, who is at least 6'2" tall and 395 pounds, was hard to miss. Recognized them too. Everyone did, at least among those who hawked cigarettes and cheap goods on the stretch of Bay Street along Tompkinsville Park. For years, they played a cat and mouse game with the NY police officers who came to arrest them. As the officers approached, Mr. Garner, 43, shouted at them to back off. According to witnesses, he flailed his arms. He refused to be detained or frisked. He had been arrested twice already that year near the same spot in March and May, charged both times for circumventing state tax law. But on that sweltering day in July, the officers left him with a warning. You figure if it stops them the first time, he said, it might get them to stop the second time. The next time came later that month, July 17th, a Thursday. One of the officers, Justin Damico, returned accompanied by a different partner, Danielle Pantaleo. As they moved in, a cell phone camera held by friend Mr. Garner recorded the struggle that would soon be seen by millions. The chokehold, the swarm of officers, the 11 pleas for breath. Mr. Garner's final words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying cry for the protest movement. On screens, large and small, his last struggle replayed on a loop. Official scrutiny and public outcry. Narrowed to focus one of the actions of a single officer. But interviews had previously undisclosed documents obtained by the New York Times provide new detail and fresh understanding of how the seemingly routine police encounter became, how it hurled towards a deadly conclusion, and how the police and emergency medical workers responded. This was not a chance meeting on the street. It was a product of police strategy to crack down on the sort of disorder that, to the police, Mr. Garner represented. Handcuffed and motionless on the ground, he did not receive immediate aid, and the apparent lapse in protocol prompted a state inquiry. The first official police report on the death failed to note the key detail that vaulted the fatal arrest into a national consciousness, that the police officer had wrapped his arm around Garner's neck. Mr. Garner's death was the start of a succession of police killings, captured national attention, and ignited debate over race and law enforcement. From Michael Brown in Ferguson, Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina, to Freddie Gray in Baltimore, the deaths of black men at the hands of police have faced a level of scrutiny that would have been unlikely just a year ago. Before Mr. Garner died and before the grand jury in December declined to bring charges to his death, of the unarmed black men killed by the police, most were shot. Mr. Gray died after being handcuffed without a seatbelt in a Baltimore police van. Mr. Garner, who was unarmed, died at the bare hands of officers. Nearly a year after the fatal encounter on Staten Island, the actions of the officers, their commanders, and emergency medical ward remained the subject of investigation. Even those investigations have yet to yield any public conclusions about the case. The intervening months have allowed the events that led to Mr. Garner's death come into clearer focus. Cell phone video gave the world an unobstructed view of the chokehold, which was found to be a cause of Mr. Garner's death, along with the compression of his chest by officers who helped to handcuff him. For all the clarity in the video it seemed to provide, the focus on the chokehold left largely unexplored crucial events before, during, and after the fatal confrontation. Tensions had been building well before July 17th. That day, a lieutenant from the 120th precinct on his way to a meeting saw a group of men on Bay Street and recognized them as a chronic source of problems in the area, said Lou Tuco, the head of Lieutenants Union. The lieutenant called the precinct. Officers Damico, Pantaleo were sent to address it. At the scene, two plainclothes officers moved in. The supervisors, who arrived moments later, never gained control. Two witnesses said they heard a sergeant tell the officers to ease up, that they held Mr. Garner down on the sidewalk. "Let up," A beauty store manager, Rodney Lee, recalled hearing the sergeant say that day, "You've got him already." For minutes, Mr. Garner lay on the ground. He was not given oxygen by the responding emergency medical personnel who were from Richmond University Medical Center. "If someone was choked out, probably they need oxygen right away," said Israel Miranda, president of Uniformed EMTs, Paramedics, and Fire Inspectors, FDNY, Local 2507. Does not represent the Richmond University medical personnel. In the hours after Mr. Garner died, an initial 5-page internal report prepared for senior police commanders, known as 49, did not refer to contact with his neck. The report, as well as the actions of supervisors, involved in part the review by the New York Police Department, a spokesman said. Instead, reports quoted by name a witness who described seeing how 2 officers each took Mr. Garner by his arms and put him on the ground. That same witness, Taisha Allen, later said she told the grand jury in Staten Island she saw a chokehold. She said the statement attributed to her in the report was not accurate. Without video of his final struggle, Mr. Garner's death may have attracted little notice or uproar. Without seeing it, the world would not have known exactly how he died. The video images were cited in the final autopsy report as one of the factors that led the city medical examiner to conclude that the chokehold and chest compression by the police, Mr. Garner's death. Absent the video, many in the police department would have gone on believing his death had been the sole cause of his health problems. Obesity, asthma, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. The autopsy report, which is confidential, was provided by a person close to Mr. Garner's family. "We didn't know anything about a chokehold or hands to the neck until the video came out," said a former senior police official with direct knowledge of the investigation, who spoke on conditions of anonymity to protect his access to confidential department information. "We found out when everyone else did. It was March last year. Gjafer Gjeshbitraj had enough. A landlord on Bay Street went online to 311 municipal hotline website to complain about men loitering outside the Staten Island apartment building. They gather to sell cigarettes and drugs," he said. One's name was Eric. "The business of loose cigarettes is simple, long-standing drive on Pennsylvania to Delaware, a nearby Indian reservation. Return to heavily taxed cigarettes, New York cheap boxes of cigarettes, sell for profit, repeat. For years, such cigarettes have been sold around Bay Street and the Park, a poor working-class area whose population swells each day, with those bound for welfare across the street. Some readily opt to buy cigarettes individually at $1 or less, rather than a whole pack at 10 times that. Mr. Garner was among a handful of them, mostly middle-aged, black, Hispanic, who sold near the park. They used the money to help support his wife, Esau, and their 6 children. We met because I have to have a place here to sell cigarettes," said Hiram Guzman, who sold loose cigarettes alongside Mr. Garner for years. He said, "You do whatever you want." That was about 6 years ago. To the local merchants, Mr. Garner was a daily presence, a friendly face to some and an unwanted competitor to others. To police department, he was a condition, a nettlesome sign of disorder, well known in the 120th precinct, whose ranks are filled with officers who also call Staten Island home. Teams of officers, such as one Officer Damico belonged to, and supposed to address such conditions. Commanders are grilled at weekly meetings on how the conditions are being addressed. Mr. Garner was a family figure, stretch of Bay Street for the New York Times. That intense focus is born of policing strategy, variously known quality of life or broken windows policing. That was popularized when William Bratton, during his first tour as a New York police commissioner in the mid-1990s. It remained in place when he returned in 2014 and continues to be the lone star of his crime-fighting approach. Even as city leaders debate the merits of less punitive measures for minor offenses in an era of lower crime, of Staten Island, Tompkins Park provides a microorganism of that approach. The park and surrounding streets, familiar to veteran Staten Island officers for past drug arrests, have seen improvement, including renovated apartment buildings on Victory Boulevard, but that remains a magnet for crime and complaints. The spot where officers approached Mr. Garner on July 17th had already that year been the site of at least 98 arrests, 100 criminal summonsing, 664 calls, 903 complaints, and 311. Among the most consequential of those complaints appeared to come from Mr. Gjeshbitraj, 47. He said in a recent interview that he complained only after physically fighting with the men who blocked and sold on the block who sold drugs. The cigarette sellers, he said, provide cover for more illicit activities. Though police officers understood the Eric of the complaint, Mr. Garner said he was referring to someone else. The complaints eventually reached police headquarters, where leaders track spikes in 311 calls for problems such as noise or graffiti, harbingers, or more serious crime. Staten Island contenders were brief in March on condition around Tompkins Park, a triangle of land just south of the borough's main courthouse. Mr. Gjeshbitraj was not the first to lament the disorder there, but after the March complaint, he saw swift changes, mostly in the form of arrest. Despite extra attention, he said the problem persisted. Gjafer Gjeshbitraj, a landlord on Bay Street, had complained to the city about men loitering outside his apartment building, selling drugs and cigarettes. In June, a unit of officers recorded video of the cigarette sales around the park. The Times viewed some of the footage. The footage was viewed by police commanders. Word trickled back to the local precinct. There were complaints. This condition persists. Officers need to address it. We chased him. We arrested him, one police officer said of Mr. Gardner, speaking on condition of anonymity. Because the department's internal investigation has yet to be disclosed publicly. But once you've chased a guy, what's a warning going to do? The Times tried to reach each of the officers listed as taking part in Gardner's arrest. some in person, others by phone or through their lawyers. None provided comments or respond to talk about the encounter. Department policy precludes officers from speaking publicly without authorization. Most days, Mr. Garner could be found around Bay Street. He played chess and checkers and stood on stools near the curb, peeled off dollar bills for children when the ice cream truck came around, and served as a kind of peacekeeper for a motley regulars who occasionally found themselves at odds. Several said friends, and those who knew him from the neighborhood. On July 17th, Mr. Garner, who had just come from eating lunch with a 23-year-old friend, Ramsey Orta, when a scuffle broke out in front of them on Bay Street. One man accused another, known as a twin, of talking inappropriately with his daughter. The girl's father punched twin in the face. Mr. Garner shot up from the stoop. "You can't keep doing this. There are kids out here," Mr. Garner said, and he held the men apart, according to Ms. Allen. The men were on their way. Soon after, police, Damico, and Pantaleo arrived. For Officer Pantaleo, 30, who joined the department in 2006, it was not a typical call. He usually worked in plain clothes until focus on violent street crime. But that afternoon, Lieutenant Christopher Bannon, driving by, spot a group included Mr. Garner on the sidewalk. He called the precinct to tell officers to get out there. According to the former police official, Officer Pantaleo was ordered to go with Officer Damico, 26, an officer since 2010. With Officer Pantaleo behind the wheel of an unmarked police car, the two officers in shorts and T-shirts circled twice, watching Mr. Garner. As they approached, many on the block recognized them as officers and believed they could, in response to the fight, witness they move and arrest Mr. Garner with surprise. As two officers closed in on Mr. Garner, Mr. Orta began taking video that would total about 16 minutes and would be shown to a grand jury impaneled on Staten Island, September, to hear evidence in the case against Officer Pantaleo. "We can do this easy way or hard way," Officer Damico told Mr. Garner, according to the transcript in the video prepared by Police Department, an Internal Bureau, and reviewed by the Times. "For what? What did I do?" Mr. Garner said. "For selling cigarettes," Officer Damico replied. In the course of the encounter, officer tried to grab his arms at least twice, according to the transcript. "Don't touch me, please. Don't touch me," Mr. Garner told them. Officer Pantaleo, anticipating an arrest, radioed for backup before swinging one arm over Mr. Garner's shoulder, around his neck, and under his arm in an attempt to twist the larger man's body to the ground. The pair rammed against a plate glass window of Bay Beauty Salon. By that time, at least 4 uniformed officers arrived. Officer Pantaleo and other officers pressed Mr. Garner onto the sidewalk. A uniformed parole sergeant, Kizzy Adonis, entered the tight frame of the video. It was not clear exactly when a second sergeant, Dhanan Saminath arrived in the report. Both described arriving as Mr. Garner was on the ground. The beauty store manager, Mr. Lee, said he heard the female sergeant say, "Let up, you got him already." The officer looked up and did not let go, Mr. Lee said. Before the grand jury, Mr. Lee said he testified briefly about what he saw. but he left feeling the jurors who were able to ask questions were interested. They didn't ask me nothing, he said. Mr. Orta also told the grand jury that the sergeant instructed officers to ease up. Let him go, he's done, Mr. Orta recalled her saying. In the video, Officer Pantaleo, who moved from holding Mr. Gardner's neck to pressing his head to the pavement, Officer Damico, and two uniformed patrolled officers, Mark Ramos and Craig Furlani, helped handcuff Mr. Gardner. As they did so, Mr. Gardner repeated, "I can't breathe." Ms. Allen also testified about the medical response to Staten Island grand jury. Credit Andrew Spear, New York Times. Edward D. Mullins, the head of the Sergeants Union, said officers and supervisors did nothing wrong. Officers can take action without sergeant's presence and regularly do. He said the lack of any reference to contact with Mr. Gardner's neck in the initial police report was troubling. Mr. Mullins said because an Internal Affairs Bureau would later prepare his own more detailed report. In addition, Mr. Mullins said no one at the scene thought a chokehold was used. Said the sergeants were still being kept inside and off the streets pending results of the department's investigation. A lawyer for Officer Pantaleo, Stuart London, declined to comment and pointed to a summary declined to comment statements provided. In December, the officer's statements to the grand jury, Officer Pantaleo testified to trying a takedown move during the arrest and said he would both crash through the glass storefront. He thought that once EMT arrived, everything would be okay, Mr. London said at the time. Officers in the videos did not appear to respond to Mr. Gardner's pleas. Sergeant Saminath reported Mr. Gardner had difficulty breathing and called an ambulance, but he said Mr. Gardner did not appear to be in great distress, the report said. The department patrol guide, its manual of rules, calls for officers to immediately send a person with a life-threatening medical condition, apparent heart attack, breathing difficulties, to the nearest hospital. At 3:32, officers radioed for an ambulance. Said a city official requested anonymity to discuss details. Response remained under investigation by authorities. About a minute and a half later, another request was made. Both were categorized as unknown, a low priority. Sergeant Adonis told investigators that she believed she heard the perpetrator state that was having difficulty breathing. According to the department's initial report, Sergeant Saminath said the ambulance he requested arrived about 5 minutes later. Witnesses said the officers did not react in accordance with Mr. Gardner's medical distress. After his death, current and former officers said those at the scene might have believed the pleas were part of a ruse to avoid arrest. And even after emergency medical workers arrived, the response appeared disorganized. Almost a year after Mr. Gardner died, a sidewalk memorial still marks the fatal injury. Credit to Andrew Spear for the New York Times. That was a photo caption. Their actions from arriving at Mr. Gardner's motionless body to be wheeled away were captured on an 8-minute video recorded by Miss Allen, who lives in the area, was on the block shopping for sandals. The video of the medical response has not been widely understood, as though the physical struggle recorded by Mr. Orta. The ambulance crew arrived unaware of Mr. Gardner's condition, or the police officers were involved. A stretcher was not immediately brought to him. A bag of oxygen equipment should have been near the body at all times was carried away. Mr. Allen said the interview with the medical worker arrived. They casually asked Mr. Garner to wake up, appearing to believe that he was faking it, she said, recounting her testimony before the grand jury. At first, the emergency medical technician, Nicole Palmeri, leaned over Mr. Garner to feel for a pulse, first on his wrist, then on his neck, according to Miss Allen. Mr. Palmeri checked for a pulse. Another EMT, Stephanie Greenberg, walked back to the ambulance to receive a stretcher. An EMT trainee followed her, walking away from Mr. Garner with the oxygen equipment. 5 medical workers were there and 2 medical technicians. The trainees and 2 paramedics who arrived later were not seen on video. They were from Richmond University Medical Center. Supervisors from the fire department are routinely dispatched to serious medical calls, but Mr. Garner call was not initially considered serious. No supervisory assistance in his medical care on the scene. Mr. Palmeri did not respond to phone messages or a letter to his relative. Mr. Greenberg declined to comment. Mr. Miranda, a union leader for city medical technicians, said that he thought the care could have been more aggressive. I didn't see any real attempt initially to treat the patient. The hospital spokesman declined to comment, citing patient confidentiality, but said the medical technicians are still being kept on partial duty while the paramedics have returned to normal duty. Mr. Garner photographed. Ms. Allen said the medical response and Mr. Garner's poor ailments seemed to preoccupy the prosecutors and grand jurors when she testified. Mr. Garner had acute asthma, hypertension, and a history of diabetes. He was also obese. Their conditions were listed as contributing factors to his death. Several times during her testimony, which kept in secret under grand jury rules, Ms. Allen said prosecutors urged her to watch her words. When she said Mr. Garner did not appear to have a pulse, the prosecutor stepped in. "Don't say it like that," she recalled, the prosecutor saying, "You're only assuming he didn't have a pulse." A prosecutor also interjected when told the jurors how Mr. Garner was taken to the ground. "I said they put him in a chokehold," Miss Allen recalled saying. "Well, you can't say they put him in a chokehold," she said, the prosecutor responded. The spokesman for the Staten Island District Attorney Office declined to comment, citing restrictions on grand jury proceedings. Roughly 4 minutes after medical workers arrived, Mr. Garner was lifted on a stretcher, with the emergency staff assisted by police officers. 12 minutes after the first request for an ambulance, emergency medical workers upgraded the seriousness of the situation to the highest priority level on Sergeant 1. They did so, the city officials. Mr. Garner was cardiac arrest. Sergeant Saminath instructed Officer Damico to ride in the ambulance with Mr. Garner. Mr. Garner was declared dead at 4:34, Richmond University Medical Center. An autopsy was performed the next day. On external examination, the neck, there was no visible injuries, according to the final report. On the inside, however, were telltale signs of choking, strap muscle hemorrhaging in his neck, and petrol hemorrhages in his eyes. No drugs or alcohol were in his system. The results of the examination contrast sharply with the police department's initial titled "Death of Perpetrator in Police Custody." Within the confines of the 120 precinct, it contained no mention of any contact with Mr. Garner's neck. 11 months later, a lush patch of green grass in a faded field in Union County, New Jersey, is all that marks Mr. Garner's grave. His mother, Gwen Carr, said she was waiting for the ground to settle as she tried to gather money for a headstone. Frustration and anger remained over his death, as many of the Central players have struggled to move on. Ramsey Orta, the man who recorded the deadly confrontation, is facing charges for gun and drug offenses that his family believes are retaliation by the police. Both arrests were made after Mr. Garner's death. The family of Mr. Garner in the talks with City about financial settlement. If we haven't made progress, we're resolving it by the anniversary of his death. We will go forward with the lawsuit, Jonathan Moore, their lawyer, said. Mr. Garner's granddaughters, Kaylee, now turns to the television where the activists appear chanting, "Hands up, don't shoot. No justice, no peace." It's cute, but it's a shame at a 3-year-old's. She knows, Mr. Garner's wife said, she should be reciting the ABCs. With a hip-hop star and protest organizers have not muted the pain of the husband's death. Empty, empty, Mr. Garner lifting a cup of coffee from beside an ashtray. From day to day, I don't even know what to do sometimes. Reverberations from death after death of unarmed black men have not helped Mr. Garner's family. It's like a vision I'm seeing again, seeing my son dying again, Mrs. Carr said. Ms. Carr, tears, recounts happy. New York City leaders, including Commissioner Bratton, are changing how minor criminal offenses are handled, exploring ways to make the outcomes less punitive, and mulling the new form of warnings in lieu of arrests or summers. Earlier this year, the police department creates a new centralized unit, the Force Investigation Division, investigated fatal police encounters. In a written response to questions, Mr. Bratton said that the creation of the unit was not a direct result of the Garner incident, but rather something that recognized needed for some general basis. He said the notion of retaining predator, Mr. Garner's death, but added, there's no question that the Garner incident added new dimensions and certainly new immediacy. Through the police department, though the police department has concluded its investigation of Mr. Warner's death, the results of the internal discipline that may come from officers are delayed until a civil rights grand jury, United States, Eastern District of New York, is completed. An investigation by Civilian Complaint Review Board, an independent agency that investigators police misconduct, have been similarly delayed. Stephen Davis, the police department's top spokesman, declined to respond to the list of questions about Mr. Garner's death. The police response became an ongoing federal and departmental reviews into the matter. In the only inquiry completed so far, Staten Island grand jury found Officer Pantaleo committed no crime when he used the chokehold, a technique banned by police rules. Daniel M. Donovan Jr., who is Staten Island District Attorney, fought to keep secret the testimony, others' evidence presented to the grand jury. In May, Mr. Donovan was elected to Congress. Elected officials and civil liberty advocates have unsuccessfully tried to pry open the grand jury transcripts. Separately, lawyers from the Civilian Review Board argued before Staten Island judge on Friday to access the transcripts. Efforts to obtain NYPD's investigation file of the incident NYPD have been unsuccessful. The board lawyers wrote in legal filings, on a recent afternoon, steps from where Mr. Garner was arrested in July, a dozen men congregated on the steps of Bay Street building owned by Mr. Gjeshbitraj, the landlord who named an Eric in his 311 complaint. A man sweating through a red tank top turned his back to a companion who put a cigarette to his palm. He raised his lips and walked away. Mr. Gjeshbitraj said the recent interview that he had no longer called the city or the police complaint about the conditions around his building. He had frequently in months and years before Mr. Garner died. The last time I called the cops, someone got choked to death. He said, Eric got killed because I called. Nate, that was the last words of the New York Times text. Eric got killed because I called. Now this is a credit of the contributors. Nate, Schweber, Benjamin Weiser contributed along with Elisa Cho and Alain Delaquérière. It's this French word, I can't pronounce it. Delaquérière. And again, the primary three who got credit for this report are Alan Baker, J. David Goodman, and Benjamin Mueller. This has been Tom Doody, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in a Google search for my site. Successful night's sleep. Ciao.